So with that, let me get started. Tonight we're going to focus on Martin Van Buren's post-presidential tour in 1842. We're going to look at his early career, give you a little bit of background. If you don't know anything about Van Buren, I want you to be a little bit up to speed. Then we'll talk about the tour itself, the purpose, what Van Buren does, sort of what he expects to get out of it and what actually does come out of it. And then we'll finish up by talking about how Van Buren's political career plays out after the 1842 tour. So if you don't know anything about Martin Van Buren, here's a very short primer. He was born in 1782 in Kinderhook, New York, which is in the Hudson River Valley. He grew up in a very modest household. His father was an innkeeper, and Van Buren was someone who throughout his life seemed to always have a little bit of a self-esteem issue, always felt like maybe he wasn't quite good enough, and so he tried to overachieve, which I think is pretty common in those circumstances. Early on, he decided to get involved in law, and so he studied to be a lawyer, became a lawyer, worked his way up in New York politics. In the 1820s, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, spent several years there, then became governor of New York for a couple of months before Andrew Jackson asked him to join his cabinet as Secretary of State, and Van Buren agreed to do that. Van Buren then spent 2 years as Secretary of State before he resigned. He resigned because of a sex scandal, not his own, someone else's, but in solidarity to try to help Jackson and try to help Jackson rejuvenate and repurpose his cabinet. Van Buren agreed to resign with others, and Jackson rewarded him by appointing him to be minister to England, which is a diplomatic position. Van Buren made it to London, and then he found out that the Senate had not actually confirmed his appointment. And so he had to come back. After a short vacation, he came back. And Jackson, once again, sort of to reward him for his loyalty, asked him to be his running mate in 1832 for Jackson's second term. Van Buren agreed. He and Jackson won in 1832, and Van Buren then served 4 years as Jackson's vice president. So by the time Van Buren gets to the end of Jackson's presidency, he's accomplished quite a bit. But probably the most significant thing that he accomplished during those years was founding the Democratic Party. Van Buren, put together a national coalition that consisted of himself in New York, Jackson in Tennessee, John C. Calhoun in South Carolina, and people like Thomas Ritchie, a newspaper editor in Richmond, Virginia. These men came together and formed a Democratic Party that was based on the old Jeffersonian party, the party of Thomas Jefferson, those principles of small government, limited government, and other things. And so that becomes, I think in many ways, what most people remember Van Buren for, even though after he finishes as Jackson's vice president, Van Buren actually becomes president. And I think the reason that we remember Van Buren more for maybe forming the Democratic Party than being president is, just to be candid, he's not a great president. I'm not supposed to say that as project director, but he's not super successful. He faces a lot of challenges. Right after taking office, the United States goes into a severe financial depression, the most severe the nation had ever faced. And Van Buren's response to that is really just to kind of keep his hands off and to do what was normal at the time, but which many Americans didn't think was the right approach. Van Buren has to deal with border conflicts with Canada. He is involved in continuing to prosecute a war with the Seminole Indians in Florida, which had begun under Jackson, doesn't finish until after Van Buren leaves office. And then he's also involved in supervising and overseeing the removal of the Cherokee via the Trail of Tears. And this is actually, I think, one of Van Buren's most significant contributions, and that may be a weird word to use because of what the Trail of Tears represented. But most people think that Jackson is the one who actually carries out that process. It's actually Van Buren who does that, much to the detriment of the Cherokee. So Van Buren faces a lot of challenges, and he's astute enough as a politician to think about, how am I going to win re-election? Because presidents are always thinking about, the next cycle. There aren't that many presidents who don't want to win again, and Van Buren is someone who wants to win again. So in late 1838, early 1839, Van Buren begins to talk about going south to visit places like Tennessee. And his reasoning, I think, is that he wants to shore up the Democratic base, which was based in the South. That is where Jackson had pulled a lot of his strength. So Van Buren is talking about this. He's corresponding with people. And he's talking to, in particular, James K. Polk and Andrew Jackson. And James K. Polk, who at that time was Speaker of the House, tells Van Buren, and Polk relays this to Jackson in this letter, Polk tells Van Buren, you don't need to come here. If you come here, particularly to Tennessee, people are going to think that you're telling them what to do. You're going to be acting like they accuse Jackson of acting, like you're going to be trying to tell people how to vote. And that is something that you simply cannot do. It's going to affect our state's politics. It's going to make you look bad. So you don't need to come. And Van Buren agrees with that. And he decides, okay, I won't go south. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to familiar territory. I'm going to go to the mid-Atlantic states, Pennsylvania, and New York in particular. He goes up into New England a little bit. And so he does this tour of New England and the mid-Atlantic states that is received with mixed reviews. Democrats love it for the most part. The Whigs were the opposition party. They don't love it so much. It gives them a lot of opportunities to talk about how Van Buren's not doing his job. He should be in Washington doing his job. He's out cavorting around the countryside in his coach, acting like a British monarch. And so that it leads to all kinds of accusations that Van Buren is an elitist and so on. So Van Buren comes away from this tour hoping it's going to help him win re-election. He is the Democratic nominee in 1840. The Whig Party, again, the opposition party, nominates William Henry Harrison, who was a War of 1812 military hero, someone who had been called out of retirement back into politics for the 1836 presidential campaign. The Whigs at that point in 1836 were a relatively new party. They put out several candidates as potential nominees, Harrison being one of those. Van Buren defeats all of them. And so Harrison had been called out of retirement, had failed in 36, but he stays in the mix. And so the Whigs nominate him in 1840. And the advantage of nominating Harrison is he's sort of like Andrew Jackson. He's a military hero. People don't know a whole lot about what he thinks, so the Whigs think that they can control him. He seems like a good call for the Whigs. And it turns out he actually is. Harrison wins the 1840 election over Van Buren fairly handily, both in the popular vote and the electoral vote. And what's interesting about this campaign, and I won't go too deep into the details, but this campaign is really remarkable because of all the ways it resembles modern-day political campaigning. The Whigs take some of the ideas that Van Buren himself had, and they take them to the national level, and they execute them almost to perfection. So they use public rallies and public speeches. They use political songs, political cartoons. They use objects. So they have these, it'll sound weird, but stay with me. They have these huge balls that they put together, usually made of leather or some sort of paper mache. They're like 10 to 12 feet in diameter. And they would put slogans and names on them of their candidates, and they would roll them down the street as part of a parade. All right, and that sounds weird, right? But it got people excited. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have TV. So you could get excited about different things, and rolling balls down the street was one of those. In fact, there are accounts in 1840 of one of those balls rolling down Main Street here in Lebanon. There was a woman up on the hill looking down and looking at the Whigs in this parade, rolling this ball down Main Street in Lebanon. So, in any case, the Whigs used those tactics and strategies to win election over Van Buren in 1840. And it shocks the Democrats. They can't believe they've lost to these people. How in the world have we lost to people who are rolling big balls down the street and who have coon skins hanging on log cabins that are on floats? I mean, they just can't believe it. And Andrew Jackson, after the election's over, Andrew Jackson writes Van Buren and says, surely to goodness, at some point, the people are going to figure out that this is a corrupt coalition, and they're going to put them in their place. They're going to come to their senses the next time around, and they'll vote for the right people. They'll vote for the Democrats, us. unfortunately for the Whigs, all the excitement, all of the success that they had falls apart very quickly because Harrison dies 1 month into office. And his vice president, John Tyler, takes over. And within 6 months, John Tyler has been kicked out of the Whig Party. He has crowds of people outside the White House yelling and screaming at him. Most of them are drunk, shocker. Yelling and screaming at him to get out. Extremely unpopular. And so Tyler will spend most of his presidency trying to figure out, how am I going to win in 1844? I don't have a party. I got to figure out some way to win. So if you're Van Buren and you are now retired, you have gone back to your new home, Lindenwold, which you had purchased during your presidency there in Kinderhook. You're in retirement. You're looking at things going on in Washington. You're thinking, there might be a shot here. You know, you probably already felt a little bit confident if you were Van Buren. I mean, you created this two-party system. You created a great political party. You know, these people who beat you, really, it's kind of a shocker that they did it. And then the party seems to be falling apart. And so you're probably sitting there thinking, okay, maybe I can make a comeback. Maybe there's some way for me to figure out how to get back into the White House. So in late 1841, Van Buren begins to write people, and he begins to tell people, like Andrew Jackson, that he's thinking about doing another visit. He's going to come south. He's going to visit South Carolina, and then he's going to head west and visit with Andrew Jackson at the Hermitage. And so he tells Jackson this, and Jackson says, come on, you know, we'll be happy to have you. And so Van Buren begins to plot that he is going to go to South Carolina and visit his son, Abraham, and his daughter-in-law, Angelica Singleton. So Abraham and Angelica had gotten married during during Van Buren's presidency. Angelica had actually served as first lady because Martin Van Buren's wife had died about 20 years before that. So he's going to go visit Abraham and Angelica down in South Carolina where her family is. And then he's going to go west and go visit Jackson at the Hermitage. So Van Buren keeps up this correspondence. He's telling people he's going to do this. Some people are writing back to him and saying, you know, we're a little bit concerned that people are going to think that you're actually trying to campaign. We're concerned that you're going to come under some of the same attacks that you did in 1839. And so Van Buren replies, you know, here's my agenda. I'm going to go visit family, going to visit Jackson, then I'm going to go home. That's my plan. And he tells other friends that he's going to do it as quietly as possible. He doesn't want any public spectacle. He doesn't want to, you know, go in with all the pomp and circumstance like he had in 1839. He wants to just do it quietly, you know, as a gentleman, as a retired president. And so this is his plan, okay? Van Buren asked his friend James Kirk Paulding, who had been Secretary of Navy in Van Buren's cabinet, asked him to go with him. Paulding had gone with Van Buren on the 1839 tour, so they were familiar with each other. They're very close at this point. So Paulding agrees that he will go with Van Buren. So in early February, Van Buren leaves Kinderhook, goes to Albany, and then heads south through Philadelphia, Baltimore, and other places. He picks up Paulding along the way, and they wind up in South Carolina at the end of the month. From Charleston, South Carolina, they are then going to go into the interior of South Carolina to visit Angelica's family and to visit some other people. And they're going to spend about 5 weeks in the interior of South Carolina. So Van Buren and Paulding go to the Singleton plantation, still owned by Richard Singleton, Angelica's father. They visit Joel Poinsett, who had been Secretary of War during Van Buren's presidency, part of Van Buren's cabinet. And then they leave the interior of South Carolina. They go across Georgia, go down through Alabama to Mobile, and then cut over to New Orleans. So while Van Buren is doing this, people are writing him, people are asking him, can we do things for you? Will you come to dinner with us? Will you let us do this and do that? And Van Buren consistently turns them down. So for example, there's a group of Mobile, Alabama citizens who write Van Buren and tell him, we want to give you a public dinner. We want you and Paulding to come. We'll celebrate you. We'll recognize you, and so on. And Van Buren replies very politely, I would prefer that you not do that. I would prefer that we do things quietly and not have a public dinner. So early on in this tour, Van Buren is sticking to the agenda, that he's just going to do it as quietly as possible. That's not to say he doesn't do public things, so he's not just sitting in his hotel room with room service. He's not just in the lobby at the bar. He does meet with people. So, for example, in New Orleans, he goes to the battlefield where Jackson had defeated the British on January 8th, 1815. He goes to the theater. So he's out and about, but it's not in a public way where people are focused on him and where he is being celebrated explicitly. From New Orleans, Van Buren and Paulding will go up the Mississippi and then cut over using the various river waterways to Nashville. And at Nashville, they're going to spend most of their time with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson reportedly was in ill health, and if you know anything about Jackson, he had been in ill health for decades, so this is really not that new, except he's getting on in age. So that was some of the urgency that Van Buren felt, was that there were reports that Jackson was very ill, that he was close to death. Sometimes there were reports that he had died. And so Van Buren wants to go pay one last visit because he knows this is probably the last time that he will see Jackson. And I think Van Buren also probably has in the back of his mind that he wants to talk to Jackson about the 1844 election and really get Jackson's advice about whether or not he should run again. Unfortunately, we don't know what they talked about. Neither Van Buren nor Jackson wrote down what they talked about during those weeks at the Hermitage. However, there is a shift that begins to happen in Nashville that I think is explained by Jackson and Van Buren having conversations about Van Buren's future in 1844. And so I want to show some of that as we go through the rest of the talk. So Van Buren, while he's in Nashville for the first part of his trip there, he does a lot of things. He arrives late at night on a rainy night, spends the night in Nashville. The next day goes to the Hermitage, goes back to Nashville, does some things, then goes back to the Hermitage again. So he's going back and forth between Nashville and the Hermitage quite a bit. As he's doing that, people are writing him just like they had before. But Van Buren is starting to respond in a different way. So remember the Mobile letter. When Van Buren responded, it was pretty generic. It was pretty general. Thank you. We don't want to do that. Look forward to seeing you. Well, in Nashville, Van Buren begins to talk in more political terms. And it's not explicit. He's not attacking his opponents. He's not really going after them. But he starts talking in political terms. So, for example, in the first paragraph on the left, he talks about Andrew Jackson, talks about how great Andrew Jackson was. And then near the end, he puts in this little point that, I tried to emulate Jackson as much as possible. And then in the paragraph on the right, Van Buren talks about some of the ways that things are starting to go wrong in the country, that there are consequences to the way that the political climate is headed. Again, not explicit attacks, but he's starting to talk politically in ways that he had not done before. And this is going to continue on throughout the rest of the tour. While Van Buren is in Nashville, he also makes plans to go visit James K. Polk down in Columbia, a little bit south of Nashville. He's going to spend 4 days with Polk, do various things, visit a woman's school, a girls' school while he's there, but he spends most of his time with Polk. And what's interesting about this particular part of the trip is that there were people who were writing James K. Polk and telling him, you've got to get Van Buren down here. You've got to get him to Murfreesboro. You have to get him to Shelbyville. You have to get him to Columbia. Because if people meet Van Buren and get to know him, they'll figure out he's just a regular guy. He's not this caricature that the Whigs have painted him to be. He's not this evil elitist, this monarchical figure. He's just a regular guy. He's a Democrat. And I think what's interesting about this is that we don't tend to think about the fact that most Americans never met a president. Most of them never saw a president. And so they're getting their information about presidents from newspapers, from the media. And newspapers at that time were very openly partisan. We can argue about whether they're partisan today or not, but they were openly partisan then. And so the Whig newspapers depict Van Buren as the worst of the worst. And of course, the Democrats depict him as good. They don't necessarily say he's the best of the best, but they say he's good. And so you have these Tennesseans who want Van Buren to meet voters so that they will see that he's a good guy, that they can connect with him. Unfortunately, Van Buren sends word that he's not going to be able to do that he's on a pretty tight schedule. Has a very short amount of time, so he's only going to go to Columbia. He's not going to visit these other places. When he's in Columbia, according to James K. Polk, Van Buren does not talk to Polk about politics, which I find very difficult to believe. Now, I'm not calling Polk a liar, but I'm saying that it's hard for me to believe because in 1840, Van Buren and Polk had been talked about actually as a ticket together. So in 1840, the Democrats had nominated Van Buren as their presidential candidate. They had not nominated a VP candidate. They had left that up to the individual states, and I'll explain why in a couple of minutes. Polk was one of the people that Democrats thought should be Van Buren's running mate. In fact, Jackson pushed really hard for Van Buren and Polk to run together. So when you look at this visit to Columbia, which takes Van Buren away from Jackson, the way that I look at it logically, again, we only have what Polk said, but I'm trying to extrapolate a little bit here. I think that Van Buren goes to Columbia to try to figure out, is Polk someone I could run with in 44? And he might also be trying to figure out, is Polk someone who wants to run himself for president in 44? Because he was someone who was already being called Young Hickory, which was a name, Hickory, that was associated with Jackson. Jackson was Old Hickory, and so being called Young Hickory was quite an honor for someone like Polk. So in any case, they spend 4 days together. Polk says they don't talk about anything political, so I guess we can take his word for it maybe. Van Buren goes back to Nashville, spends another week at the Hermitage. During that time, I think he probably does two things based on the timing. One, for sure he gets his portrait made. So that's Van Buren on the left, and on the right you have the artist, a very famous Tennessee artist, Washington Bogart Cooper. And so that's actually Cooper as a self-portrait, so he painted himself there on the right. We know that this happened around this time because newspapers start talking about selling this portrait, and this is the only time that Van Buren and Cooper were in proximity to one another as far as we know. So they probably did it during this period. The second thing that may have happened, and I'm hedging my bets here because I'm not certain about this, the second thing that may have happened is that Van Buren may have renamed a very prominent location that is still in existence here in Nashville. So Andrew Jackson had a bunch of nieces and nephews, most of whom were named Andrew and Rachel, which if you're doing genealogy is really infuriating. But that's my own problem, I guess. So one of those nephews was Andrew Jackson Donaldson, who lived just down the road from Jackson at the Hermitage. And so Van Buren and Donaldson knew each other. Van Buren, in fact, had loaned Donaldson quite a bit of money, and so I'm certain that he visited Donaldson. I'm absolutely certain he did and asked, where's my money? What I'm not so certain about is whether or not, according to family legend, Van Buren went to Donaldson's home, looked around at the tulip poplars, and said, you know, you call this place Poplar Grove, but it really should be called Tulip Grove. And that's where Tulip Grove, the name Tulip Grove, came from. And you can still visit the home there on the Hermitage property, and there are lots of locations around that area that are called Tulip Grove. And supposedly that's because of Van Buren. Again, not certain, but that's what the Donaldson family says. In any case, Van Buren, during this time that he's in Nashville, he decides to change his itinerary. Instead of heading back home, so his original plan was to go back through Kentucky and then go back to Kinderhook. Instead of doing that, he's going to go up to Kentucky. He's got a couple more stops to make, and then he's going to go elsewhere. So he lays out to his son, Martin Jr., where else he's going to go. And what he tells Martin Jr. is that there's so much pressure, there's so many invitations that he just doesn't feel like he can say no. And because they're already there, why not do it? All right? We're in the area, sort of. We're getting invitations. We feel like we need to do this. This is not what he intended. And so, again, this is speculation, but I'm wondering if as Jackson and Van Buren talked, and as Van Buren began to become more political in his responses to letters and invitations, if Jackson and Van Buren didn't say, maybe a good strategy would be, if you do want to run in 44, let's test the waters everywhere else. You might be popular in South Carolina with your family there, with Angelica's family. You might be popular in other places like New Orleans, where Jackson was, popular. You might be popular in Middle Tennessee, where Jackson and Polk lived. But what about elsewhere? So maybe you need to test the waters and see what things are like. Again, speculation. But for whatever reason, Van Buren extends his trip for quite a number of weeks. He leaves the Hermitage in mid-May, goes through Gallatin, will go up to White Sulphur, Kentucky, and he will meet with two people there. He will meet first with Henry Clay. Henry Clay was the presumptive presidential nominee in 1844. Most people thought that Clay would be the Whigs' nominee to run for president. Clay and Van Buren knew each other from the Senate. They'd known each other for a long time. Clay had invited Van Buren to visit him. It was on the way, so that kind of makes sense. But I wonder if Clay was trying to figure out what Van Buren's plans were, if Van Buren was truly going to run in 44. It seemed logical that he might want to. And I wonder if Van Buren was trying to figure out, okay, Clay looks like he's going to run for sure. That seems to be a given. What's his strategy going to be? Is he going to attack me? Is he going to focus on Tyler? What's he going to do? So I think, again, there's a little bit of a feeling out process that's taking place behind the scenes. Now, Clay is a little bit more honest than Polk, I think. He says, we talked about politics a little bit, which, again, I don't think is totally believable. I think they probably talked about it a lot, but at least I think he's acknowledging that there was an elephant in the room and they were talking about it, more so than Polk had done. After leaving Clay, he was there for about a week. Van Buren goes up the road just a little bit and visits Richard M. Johnson. Richard M. Johnson had been Van Buren's vice president, so it makes sense they had a relationship. But Van Buren is probably trying to figure out if Johnson's going to run for president again. Or if Johnson doesn't run for president, if Van Buren decides to, would Johnson want to be on the ticket again? And if so, Van Buren's got a decision to make, because one of the reasons the Democrats had not chosen a running mate in 1840 was because of Johnson. Johnson was a bit eccentric, and he was especially eccentric at the time because he openly had relationships with the women he enslaved. He lived basically in a common law marriage with one enslaved woman, had 2 daughters by her, and then reportedly had relationships with other enslaved women that were open and public. And so it wasn't necessarily that he had the relationships. That was not uncommon. It was the openness of it. And that had caused the Democrats problems during the 1836 campaign and during the 1840 campaign. So in any case, Van Buren is probably trying to figure out what are Johnson's plans here. Unfortunately, we don't know what they talked about, if anything, regarding that, because neither one left a record. After leaving Johnson's, Van Buren goes north to Ohio, cuts across Indiana, Illinois to St. Louis. As he's doing so, he meets someone who becomes very famous in the future, not so famous at that time. In Springfield, the roads were very muddy. Van Buren got stuck, had to stay overnight. And according to one of Lincoln's friends in his memoirs several decades later, a bipartisan group of Springfield citizens went and entertained Van Buren that night, and one of those people was Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln, as he was known to do, told a bunch of stories, told a bunch of jokes, to the point that Van Buren's sides were hurting. And it was a night that no one ever forgot, according to this friend. After leaving Springfield, again, Van Buren goes west to St. Louis. Along the way, he's going to be giving speeches. So notice what's happened. Van Buren starts out, no public demonstrations, very generic, general responses. And then he begins to add politics to those responses, those written responses. Now he's openly giving speeches. And he's giving speeches in which he's referring to the political climate. So in this particular case, he's talking about the fact that there's a hyper-partisanship in the United States, and he's looking forward to the ways that Americans can unite and get along again with one another. All right? So again, not openly attacking the Whigs, but he's hinting there's something going on, and he's doing it in public speeches. Okay. Once Van Buren gets to St. Louis, he will then go up to the Great Lakes region, will cut over, and will wind up back at Kinderhook by the end of July. Along the way, he continues to give speeches. For example, in Cleveland, Ohio, he talks about how terrible the political climate is. He begins to hint even more strongly who's responsible for it, even though he doesn't name the Whigs outright. And so what you see, I think, happening with Van Buren's tour is that he starts out with one idea, one agenda, and as things go along, particularly after he hits Nashville, after he visits Jackson at the Hermitage, he begins to change his strategy and begins to change his approach and becomes more openly campaigning in a way that he had not before. Newspapers, opposition newspapers, from the very start had said this was what Van Buren was doing. So as Van Buren is setting out, there's a New York City newspaper that says that Van Buren is setting out not just to shake the paw of the old lion, Jackson, but he's also in the field for the next presidency. He's already campaigning. You have other newspapers in Tennessee talking about Van Buren trying to ride Jackson's coattails, just like he had before. You have another talking about how when Van Buren visited with James K. Polk, they were trying to put together a ticket to run together in 1844. They'd already made that agreement. There's a newspaper in Boston that is an abolitionist newspaper. It says a lot of things, and you don't have to read all that, but one of the things that it says near the end is that Van Buren is traversing the country trying to win votes northern and southern. And what's clear to this newspaper is that one of the key issues that is going to be important in 44 is Texas annexation. And that one of the reasons Van Buren visited Clay was so that they were both on the same page. Well, what's interesting about that is that in 1842, Texas was not an under-the-radar issue. People were talking about it, but it was not a major campaign issue. By 1844, it will be a major campaign issue. It will be. So this newspaper is actually very prescient in looking ahead and saying, here's an issue that's going to be really, really important, and Van Buren is going to be part of why it's so important. After Van Buren gets back, he writes Jackson shortly after and says what a great time he had, that the people had really treated him very well. He had really enjoyed their kindness and all their hospitality. A couple of months later, Van Buren has obviously been ruminating about this more. He writes Jackson again, and he tells Jackson, you know, that election of 1840, in his words, was the result of the most criminal practices against the purity of the elective franchise. So you can tell he's getting his back up. He's getting his dander back up. He's ready to go back into the fight. In early 1843, Van Buren actually does begin campaigning openly and officially. He will spend 15 months attempting to win the Democratic nomination. The Democrats will meet in Baltimore in May of 1844, and they will not choose Van Buren. And the reason they do not choose Van Buren is because of Texas annexation. By May of 1844, and in fact, a couple months before that, Texas annexation had become a very important issue to voters. And Van Buren and Clay both had come out openly against the immediate annexation of Texas. They did it on the exact same day. Does not mean that they coordinated it. I think that's one of those pure chances of luck. People looking back are like, oh, they must have, in 42, they got together and figured out, on this day, we're going to do this together. I don't think that happened at all. I think it's just luck. But what it does is, it doesn't really harm Clay that much, but Van Buren it does, because the Democrats by that point were very strongly pro-annexation, very strongly pro-expansion. And so they're determined that they want Texas, and if Van Buren is standing in the way, they're going to pick somebody else. And that person winds up being James K. Polk, who was very openly and very strongly pro-expansion and pro-annexation. So Van Buren loses that nomination. 4 years later, he will run for the presidency again. He actually gets a nomination. He's nominated by the Anti-Slavery Free Soil Party. This was a party that was, as I said, anti-slavery. which did not fit Van Buren. He was not someone who was strongly anti-slavery. In fact, he had always aligned himself with the pro-slavery South. So there are two reasons I think Van Buren runs as president for the Free Soil ticket in 48. One, I think he's mad at the Democrats. I think he's upset that he had not been nominated, and I think he's very upset that the Polk wing of the Democratic Party had not listened to his advice about appointments. So Van Buren had given lots of advice to Polk about who to appoint to the cabinet and other things, and Polk had pretty much ignored him. So I think he's upset, and so this is kind of a middle finger to the Democrats for not picking him. Two, Van Buren's son John was running for office in New York State in 48. And so I think Van Buren sees this as an opportunity to help his son, for Van Buren to use his name recognition to help his son John win office, which does not happen, unfortunately, for him. After the 48 election, Van Buren will return to the Democrats. He will serve as the elder statesman of the party. By the 1850s, really until 1857, he is the only remaining Democratic president still alive. So he is the elder statesman. He is the one that Democrats are looking to for advice as the nation is starting to divide and fall apart, leading up to the Civil War. In July of 1862, Van Buren passes away at his home there in Kinderhook, and that ends his life. So why is this tour important? Why should we care about this? Well, I think, first of all, it's the first campaign by a former president. And so the first time something happens, we should pay attention to it. And when you're talking about the presidency, as someone who's a presidential historian, it's important to recognize what's happening. So I think that's one reason to pay attention. Two, I think it shows the way that people, even former presidents, are shaped by the circumstances around them. Again, I'm not certain that Van Buren started that tour wanting to run again. I'm not certain that he had that fire in his belly to do it again, but certainly by the end he did. And he gets that way because he's being shaped by the circumstances and the people around him. And I think that's an important thing to recognize about people who run for office again once they've lost office. You know, sometimes they do it for many reasons, I know, but sometimes they leave office and they're sad about it, but then they get that fire back because they realize I can make a difference. And Van Buren thought he could make a difference. He thought he could restore the country back to the principles that he and Jackson had stood for. So those are a couple of reasons why it's important.